The HOA tried to steal my backyard for a community pool. Now they owe me $155,000. They spread lies, fined me thousands, and even threatened legal action, all to force me into giving up my land. But I exposed their corruption, took them to court, and now? Their president resigned in disgrace, their board is crumbling, and they're paying me $155,000 in damages. They tried to break me, now they're the ones who lost everything. Moving into his new home was supposed to be the start of something special for James Parker. After years of saving and searching, he had finally found the perfect place, a cozy two-bedroom house with a spacious backyard just outside the city. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was exactly what he wanted: peace, privacy, and a little bit of land to call his own. James had never been a fan of homeowners associations, HOAs, which was why he had specifically chosen a home outside of their reach. He had done his homework, checked property records, reviewed zoning laws, and made sure there were no hidden restrictions that would allow an HOA to dictate what he could or couldn't do with his own home. This was his space, his sanctuary. For the first few weeks, life was everything he had imagined. Mornings spent sipping coffee on the back porch, weekends working on his garden, and late afternoons enjoying the shade of the old oak tree that stood proudly in his backyard. No noisy neighbors, no unwanted rules, just peace and quiet. Until they showed up. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and James was outside trimming the bushes along his wooden fence when he spotted two well-dressed strangers walking down the sidewalk. Something about them immediately felt off. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, purposeful and stiff, or the large rolled-up blueprint the woman was holding in her hand. As they reached his gate, the woman, a blonde in a neatly pressed navy blazer, gave him a polished, practiced smile. The man beside her, slightly taller with a stiff posture, stood silently with his hands folded in front of him. "Good morning. You must be James Parker," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Susan Monroe, and this is my colleague, Brad Nelson. We're with the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association." James hesitated for a second before shaking her hand. "Morning. But I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm not part of the HOA." Susan's smile didn't waver. "Oh, we know," she said smoothly. "But we wanted to talk to you about a unique opportunity that would benefit both you and the entire community." James raised an eyebrow. "Opportunity?" With a practiced flourish, Susan unrolled the blueprint and held it out for him to see. James squinted at the paper, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. It only took a few seconds before his stomach dropped. It was his backyard, or at least, it had been. The blueprint showed a massive community pool, complete with a fenced perimeter, several lounge areas, and even a small playground. His quiet retreat had been transformed into what looked like a country club facility. James blinked, his brain working to process the absurdity of what he was seeing. "This is my property," he said slowly, looking up at them in confusion. "That's correct," Susan chirped, as if this was the best news in the world. "Your backyard is the perfect location for a community pool. It's right in the heart of Maplewood Estates, easily accessible for everyone. This would be an amazing addition to the neighborhood." James felt an instant surge of irritation. He had specifically chosen this home because it wasn't under the HOA's control. The idea that they were standing here, casually presenting him with plans to take over his property, was beyond ridiculous. "I'm not interested," he said firmly. "I moved here for privacy, not to turn my backyard into a public pool." Brad finally spoke up, his voice smooth but with a hint of impatience. "James, we're just asking you to consider the benefits. A pool like this would raise everyone's property values, including yours." James let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't care about property values. What I care about is my home staying my home." Susan's smile flickered, the first sign of irritation slipping through her polished demeanor. She exchanged a glance with Brad before turning back to James. "Well, of course, we understand your concerns," she said, her voice still pleasant but with a forced edge. "We just hope you'll think about how much this would mean to the community." James crossed his arms. "I don't need to think about it. The answer is no." Susan rolled the blueprint back up with a quick, sharp motion, her friendly mask cracking just a little. "All right, James. We appreciate your time." Brad gave him a tight nod. "We'll be in touch." James watched as they turned and walked away, their polished confidence replaced with a barely concealed air of frustration. A nagging sense of unease settled in his gut as he stared after them. He didn't like the way they had spoken to him, and he had a bad feeling that this wasn't the last he'd hear from them. James thought that after his firm rejection, the matter would be settled. But by Monday morning, he realized the HOA had no intention of giving up. As he stepped outside to check his mailbox, he noticed a glossy flyer taped to a street lamp near his house. His stomach tightened as he recognized the same blueprint Susan and Brad had shown him just days before. Bold letters across the top read, "Coming soon. Maplewood Estates Community Pool." His eyes scanned the text beneath it, his frustration growing with every word. It described his backyard as the perfect location for a neighborhood gathering space, complete with seating areas, a playground, and family-friendly events. Nowhere did it mention that the homeowner, him, had never agreed to any of this. His annoyance turned to anger as he walked down the street and saw more flyers posted at intersections, on mailboxes, even pinned to the community board at a nearby coffee shop. The HOA had already begun spreading the news as if the project was a done deal. The real punch to the gut came later that afternoon when his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, a friendly older woman who had always greeted him warmly, waved him down as he was getting out of his car. "James, dear, I just wanted to say how wonderful it is that you're letting the neighborhood use your backyard for the pool. My grandkids are going to love it." James nearly dropped his keys. "Wait, what?" He forced a chuckle, assuming it was a misunderstanding. "I told the HOA no. That's not happening." Mrs. Caldwell blinked in confusion. "Oh, but Susan said you'd agreed. They even showed us the designs. Everyone's been talking about it all morning." A wave of irritation crashed over him. "I don't know what they told you, but I never agreed to anything. This is my property. I have no obligation to build a public pool for anyone." Her smile faltered, and for the first time since he moved in, James noticed something shift in her expression. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was an unmistakable hint of disappointment, as if he had just ruined something good. "Oh, well, I suppose I must have misunderstood," she said, her tone polite but noticeably cooler than before. Over the next few days, similar encounters kept happening. Neighbors he barely knew suddenly stopped him on the sidewalk, offering excited congratulations on his generosity. Parents mentioned how their kids were so excited for summer swim days. When James corrected them, their reactions were almost identical. First confusion, then disappointment, then a polite but obvious chill in their tone. By midweek, it became clear what was happening. The HOA wasn't just spreading misinformation. They were painting him as the bad guy before he even had a chance to defend himself. They were letting the community believe the pool was already agreed upon, making him look like the one going back on his word. By Friday, the shift in how people treated him was undeniable. The friendly waves he used to get when driving through the neighborhood were becoming less frequent. Conversations were shorter, colder. At the grocery store, he overheard two women whispering about him near the produce aisle. "I just don't understand why he's being so difficult," one of them muttered. "It's for the whole community. He's being so selfish." That was when James realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The HOA had set him up, turning his refusal into a betrayal. They hadn't pressured him directly after that first visit, but they didn't have to. They had weaponized the entire neighborhood against him. He clenched his jaw as he stepped out of the store, determined not to let them break him. If they thought this was enough to get him to back down, they were dead wrong. James had expected the cold shoulders and whispers after the HOA's misinformation campaign, but he hadn't anticipated what came next. It started with a letter taped to his front door, an official-looking document from the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. He frowned as he peeled it off and read the bolded heading. "Notice of violation. Urgent action required." The letter claimed that his front yard fence was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards and demanded that he repaint or replace it within 30 days. His irritation flared. His fence was the same one that had been there when he bought the house, well-maintained and in perfect condition. More importantly, he wasn't even a part of the HOA. He tossed the letter on the kitchen counter, assuming it was just an empty threat. But 2 days later, a second letter arrived. This one cited his landscaping as a violation, specifically calling out his bushes and flower beds for being unauthorized modifications. By the end of the week, he had received 3 more notices. One claimed his patio furniture was out of compliance because it didn't match the community color scheme. Another warned that his lawn was improperly maintained, despite the fact that he had just mowed it. The final notice accused him of using his backyard improperly because of the outdoor seating area he had set up. James was furious. The letters were pure nonsense, a blatant attempt to harass him into submission. He grabbed the entire stack, drove to a nearby law office, and sat down with a lawyer named Mark Ellis, a no-nonsense guy in his mid-40s who had seen plenty of HOA power trips before. After looking over the letters, Mark leaned back in his chair and let out a short laugh. "James, they have no authority over you. Zero. These letters are meaningless." James exhaled, feeling a brief wave of relief. "So they can't actually find me? Or force me to change anything?" Mark shook his head. "Nope. You're outside their jurisdiction, and you never signed any agreements with them. They're banking on the fact that most homeowners panic when they see official-looking letters. This is intimidation, nothing more." That was exactly what James had suspected. "So what do I do? For now? Ignore them, but keep every letter they send you. If they escalate this further, you'll want a paper trail." James left the office feeling more prepared, but that sense of relief didn't last long. The next morning, he found yet another violation notice taped to his door. This one warned him that continued non-compliance would result in escalating fines, $250 for the first infraction, $500 for the next. It was clear the HOA had no intention of backing off. By the end of the week, the fines had reached $1,000, and a final notice arrived, threatening legal action. James wasn't sure what infuriated him more, the HOA's audacity, or the fact that they were still acting like they had any legal standing at all. He kept documenting every interaction, every letter, every fake fine. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. James had had enough. Every morning, he found yet another ridiculous violation notice stuck to his door, each one more absurd than the last. The fines kept piling up, reaching a laughable $2,500 within 2 weeks. The latest one accused him of having a garden gnome that clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. He almost laughed at the sheer pettiness, but underneath the frustration was something else, a growing determination. They wanted to bully him into submission. They wanted him to feel overwhelmed, isolated, and trapped. But they had underestimated just how stubborn he could be. James started meticulously documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every encounter with neighbors who mentioned the HOA. He took photos of his fence, his yard, his patio furniture, proof that everything was in perfect condition. He even set up a security camera near his door to record the HOA's enforcement officers sneaking up at night to leave their bogus notices. Then, the HOA made their biggest move yet. A certified letter arrived, this time stamped with legal language, threatening a lawsuit if he didn't comply. The letter claimed that if he didn't pay his fines in full, they would take him to court for non-compliance and outright lie, since they had no legal authority over his property. But that wasn't the part that made James' blood boil. It was the final paragraph. Should legal action proceed, be advised that court fees and additional penalties may apply. However, if you reconsider your position and agree to cooperate with the Maplewood Estates Community Pool Project, all fines and violations will be dropped immediately. That was it. That was the whole game. They didn't care about his fence, his lawn, or his so-called violations. This was nothing more than a pressure campaign to force him into giving up his backyard. They were trying to extort him into compliance. James sat at his kitchen table, gripping the letter so tightly his knuckles turned white. They thought they could threaten him into submission. They thought he would just give in. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, James made a different kind of phone call. Not to his lawyer, he'd do that in the morning, but to a local news station. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to expose them. The following morning, he met with a reporter from Channel 5 News, handing over a folder full of documentation, the violation notices, the security footage, the extortion letter. The reporter, a woman named Erica Moore, flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from mild interest to outright shock. "Wait, they're threatening legal action over a property that isn't even under their jurisdiction?" she asked. James nodded. "And trying to force me into giving up my land for their pool project." She exhaled sharply. "Oh, they're going to love this at the station." A few days later, James watched as the segment aired on TV. The story was brutal. The news team laid out the HOA's intimidation tactics, exposing their bogus fines, their threats, their lies. The camera zoomed in on the letter demanding James give up his yard in exchange for clearing his fines. It was damning. James had expected some reaction, but he wasn't prepared for how fast things escalated. By the next morning, social media exploded with people calling out Maplewood Estates HOA for their overreach. Comments flooded in, some from locals who had their own HOA horror stories, others from people in nearby communities outraged by what was happening. And then, the unexpected happened. The city council got involved. A statement was released that same evening. The city of Maplewood takes allegations of HOA misconduct seriously. We will be reviewing the actions of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association to determine if any legal overreach has occurred. James sat on his couch, watching the news recap of the investigation announcement. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, he felt like he was winning. The HOA had wanted a fight. Now, they had won. James had expected some fallout after the news story aired, but he hadn't anticipated just how fast things would spiral. By the next morning, social media was flooded with angry comments about the Maplewood Estates HOA, with people calling them out for overreach, corruption, and flat-out harassment. The story had struck a nerve, not just in his neighborhood, but in HOA-controlled communities across the state. Other homeowners started sharing their own horror stories of overbearing HOAs that had fined them for things as petty as parking in their own driveway or having the wrong color mailbox. The outrage was instant and massive. Then, the city council announced their investigation. That was the moment James knew things had officially turned against Susan and Brad. The council's statement was direct and brutal, saying they would be reviewing whether the Maplewood Estates HOA engaged in illegal intimidation tactics and overstepped its jurisdictional authority. The very next day, James noticed something strange. His neighbors started treating him differently. People who had ignored him or given him cold looks just a week ago were suddenly friendlier. Some stopped to chat, asking if he was doing okay. Others mumbled awkward apologies, clearly embarrassed that they had believed the HOA's lies about him. Even Mrs. Caldwell, who had once seemed so disappointed in him, stopped by with a plate of cookies, muttering something about how she never liked Susan much anyway. And then came the HOA meeting. Normally, these meetings were dull, filled with bureaucratic nonsense, but this time, half the neighborhood showed up, and they were furious. James didn't even have to say a word. The moment Susan and Brad took the floor, people started demanding answers. Why had they lied about James agreeing to the pool? Why had they tried to fine him for things they had no authority over? Why had they threatened legal action when they had no legal claim to his property? Susan's usual confident smile was nowhere to be seen. She stumbled through excuses, saying it had all been a misunderstanding, that they had only been trying to do what was best for the community. But it was too late. The tipping point came when an older man stood up and said loudly, "If they did this to James, what's stopping them from doing it to the rest of us?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. That was all it took. The illusion of power was gone. People were no longer afraid of the HOA. By the end of the meeting, Susan and Brad were visibly shaken. They had controlled this neighborhood for years, but now they were cornered, exposed, and running out of excuses. And James? He just sat back and watched it all crumble. Even with the public backlash, the city council's investigation, and the growing number of neighbors turning against them, the HOA still refused to back down. It was almost impressive in a pathetic kind of way. Just when James thought they might finally back off, he woke up to yet another stack of violation notices taped to his door. This time, they had doubled down, fining him for everything they could come up with: $500 for an unauthorized flower bed, $750 for a non-conforming outdoor seating area, and an outrageous $1,500 fine for excessive lawn growth, despite the fact that he had mowed it just 2 days before. The total? Over $5,000 in fines. The message was clear. If they were going down, they were going to make this as painful for him as possible. James didn't even hesitate. He had documented everything, had kept every single letter, fine, and interaction. He met with his lawyer, who didn't even try to hide his grin as he flipped through the growing mountain of evidence. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen," Mark said, shaking his head. "They've harassed you, tried to extort you, lied about their authority, and now they're issuing baseless fines out of spite. Let's take them down." Within days, James officially filed a lawsuit against the Maplewood Estates HOA for harassment, defamation, and unlawful interference with his right to enjoy his property. The legal papers were delivered directly to the HOA's office, and if he had to guess, Susan and Brad must have lost their minds when they saw them. But now, they had no choice. They had been threatening legal action for weeks. Now they were about to see what a real lawsuit looked like. The case moved fast, thanks to the public pressure and the ongoing city investigation. When the court date arrived, James walked into the courtroom with his lawyer, feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks: complete confidence. Across the room, Susan and Brad sat stiffly with their own attorney, who already looked like he was regretting his decision to take their case. The trial wasn't long, but it was brutal. James's lawyer systematically tore through every piece of the HOA's argument. He presented photo evidence proving that every so-called violation was fabricated, played security footage showing HOA enforcers sneaking onto his property to leave bogus notices, and, most damning of all, introduced the letter in which the HOA outright admitted that all the fines would be dropped if he agreed to the pool project. It was clear-cut extortion, and the judge's face hardened the moment he read it. When Susan took the stand, she tried to spin the situation as a miscommunication, claiming they had only been trying to improve the community. But when she was asked point-blank why they continued to fine James for violations that didn't exist, she floundered. Then, the moment that sealed their fate, James's lawyer played an audio recording from his visit to the HOA office, where Susan had admitted they were willing to do whatever it takes to push the pool project forward. The judge's expression was stone-cold. The verdict came swift and merciless. The judge ruled in James's favor, finding that the HOA had engaged in harassment, defamation, and fraudulent fines. The Maplewood Estates HOA was ordered to cease all actions against him immediately, revoke all fines, and pay him $155,000 in damages for the stress, legal fees, and interference with his property rights. On top of that, the judge issued a formal warning that any further harassment could result in criminal charges. The courtroom was silent as the ruling was read, but James could see the pure humiliation on Susan and Brad's faces. They had spent weeks trying to break him, thinking they had all the power. Now, they were the ones who had lost everything. James walked out of that courtroom a free man. The fallout from the court ruling was immediate and devastating for the HOA. Not only were they forced to drop all fines and pay James $155,000 in damages, but they also had to issue a public apology, something that clearly made Susan and Brad want to crawl into a hole and never come out. The HOA's official statement, published in the local newspaper and emailed to every resident of Maplewood Estates, was a pathetic attempt at damage control, filled with empty phrases about misunderstandings and unintended stress. But no one was buying it. By the end of the week, both Susan and Brad had resigned. Whether they did it willingly or were forced out by the board to save face, James didn't care. They were gone. And with them, the ridiculous power-hungry reign of the HOA collapsed. The new HOA leadership, clearly desperate to rebuild trust with the community, took a completely different approach. They held an emergency meeting, promising transparency and reform. Their first action? Reviewing every single fine and regulation imposed under Susan's leadership. Several homeowners who had been quietly dealing with their own bogus violations suddenly found themselves receiving letters stating that their fines had been revoked. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. For the first time in weeks, people weren't walking on eggshells. James, however, had zero interest in attending HOA meetings or listening to their apologies. He had one, and that was all that mattered. His backyard remained untouched, his privacy restored, and best of all, he had set a precedent. The HOA couldn't just bully people into submission anymore. For the first time since this nightmare began, James sat in his backyard with a cup of coffee, staring at the oak tree, feeling nothing but peace. No more notices. No more fines. No more HOA enforcers creeping around his property. Just silence and the knowledge that he had fought back and won. He knew that some of his neighbors had doubted him at first, had believed the HOA's lies, but that didn't bother him anymore. In the end, the truth had come out. People had seen what kind of abuse of power the HOA had tried to pull, and now they were held accountable. As he leaned back in his chair, feeling the afternoon breeze, James thought about how close he had come to just giving in, to signing away his rights just to make the harassment stop. He was glad he hadn't. This was his home, his property, and no one, not an HOA, not a couple of power-drunk board members, not an entire neighborhood, was going to take that from him. With a satisfied sigh, he set down his coffee, stretched out his legs, and finally let himself relax. It was over, and he had won.